Oh, and good evening. It's May 21st, right? 2026. And welcome to another one of our branches on the vine with the Bible Project. So tonight, we're going to begin exploring the Ten Commandments. Yeah, the Bible Project has begun a new series as they engage on this study of instructions, these rules, this guidance, this wisdom that God has given us in Torah. So this series is going to follow the work of the Bible Project. It's going to guide us as we journey through the entire series. Remember, the videos we're going to discuss, they're only the tip of the iceberg. They're part of a much larger learning series from the Bible Project, one of course I highly recommend, and you can find all of those source videos on their app and on their website. So let's start the discussion on this sacred collection together, with wandering dusty feet along our path. Our hope with the Dusty Feet is to foster discussion and to help build and support communities. If you're not already connected to a community or just want to share and interact, this community has 4 primary ways to interact. 1. TheDustyFeet.com. That's our primary place to find everything. You are always free to comment. 2. Substack. Link is in the description below. It's designed around the written and spoken text. It's a place to connect to ourselves and others. 3. Facebook. At the Dusty Feet. These videos and other videos are also available for comment and discussion. 4. And as always, you're welcome to send an email to bob@thedustyfeet.com. These places, they will be moderated and guidelines will be set to ensure healthy, safe discussion. And of course, before we move on, quick reminder, if you find these conversations useful, please click subscribe. But that reminder, again, is just for you. And if you think these series might be useful to someone else, that's when you click that like button, right? Because along the way, we're going to ask a lot of questions. Questions about the text, people, patterns, history, choices, and maybe what they might mean. As for answers, we'll see where the path takes us. So to start us off, we need to get our bearings, right? So let's listen to the opening video from the Bible Project on theirs on the first commandment, and we'll see where we go. Enjoy.
The Ten Commandments don't come out of nowhere. They are what God says to Israel after he rescues them out of Egypt and then brings them to the foot of Mount Sinai. And God's offer is this: listen to my voice and keep my covenant.
Okay.
The terms of this covenant are gonna set you apart. So you'll be a holy nation set apart. You'll be a priestly kingdom, and then my representatives to the nations. So that's God's offer, and the Ten Commandments are the first of these terms of the covenant. And they begin this way. Exodus 20, verse 2. I am Yahweh, your Elohim, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So notice what we begin with is who God is to the people. This is a family whose fundamental identity is we used to be slaves. So we are a liberated people. Yahweh is our liberator, which means that one way to think about the Ten Commandments is it's like a freedom ethic. It's the ethic of the free.
How to live as a free people.
Yeah. Also, this thing of I am Yahweh, your Elohim. I'm yours. There's a phrase that's going to get repeated throughout Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and the prophets. This phrase where God will say, I will be your God and you will be my people. And this is really similar to the well-known phrase from the Song of Songs. I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. This is covenant language.
Okay.
So there's no command here. The first words of the Ten Commandments are not a command. They're just a statement. So with that in mind, let's now hear the first actual command of the 10 words. There will not be for you any other Elohim before me. Now, that little phrase, before me, al panei or al panai, is a very common prepositional phrase. It's the grammar term to refer to something being in a physical location, like right in front of you.
Okay.
It most literally means in front of my face. But this phrase also can mean against the face.
Okay.
So let's say you have a hostile army coming towards you. They are also before your face.
Before your face, but they're coming against you.
Against your face.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So this phrase, all pene, also, this can be confusing to us, can be used not in the sense of in front of you, but in the sense of beside you. It is sometimes used in the sense of instead of.
It's very flexible.
It's very flexible, but you can actually plug this idea of no other Elohim into every one of those meanings, and it works.
So don't put anything else in front of me, beside me, against me, instead of me.
There will not be for you any other Elohim. No thing else is your life.
Okay. And Elohim is the Hebrew word that just means spiritual being.
Yes, and it is used to refer to the one God of Israel, creator of all, but then also to other spiritual beings, real or imagined.
We do know that there's other spiritual beings. We call them the host of heaven.
Yeah, and then they're also called by other titles in the Bible. So messengers, that is angels. You have the divine council members, like the sons of God, spirits. This is the class of creatures that are spiritual beings. Deuteronomy 10:17, Moses says, Yahweh, your Elohim, he is the Elohim of Elohim.
Yeah, he's in a class of its own.
Yes, any other spiritual being other than Yahweh isn't on the same rank as Yahweh.
Yeah.
And is not worthy of your ultimate loyalty and allegiance.
Okay. In our context, we kind of dismiss this idea almost too much of other spiritual powers.
Yeah. But we do actually still have these higher powers, higher ideals that command our loyalty. And when humans give our imaginations and desires and allegiances to anything that's not the source of all reality, it will eventually lead us on a path that dehumanizes us and other people. I guess it's kind of easy to see that with sex, for example, or with money.
With greed.
Yeah, or with power. When those become ends in themselves, it leads to our destruction.
Yeah.
It's possible to live your human existence in a lie, thinking that someone or something or some power has a claim on me that actually doesn't. But when I get in touch with the one who truly has a claim on my life, because they're the author of my life, then I'm living in the truth and I'm living in the road to freedom. That's a concept that we're watching come into birth right here as we hear God say these words. These are world-shaping words, and it's just the first command.
So what'd you think, right? I think this is a great place to begin. It gives us so much more to ponder. There's thoughts, there's ideas, there's things. Gather around, people, and you can talk amongst yourselves. We got a lot to expand upon. So let's begin by walking into the heart of what many of us call the Torah, right? We're starting with the 10 Commandments, these laws, right, given by God. But before we rush in, right, because we think of them as a list of rules, restrictions, religious obligations. And I think we need to slow down, pump the brakes. Because I think there's a different way to notice how they begin in the story. This is the scriptural end. Because, as Tim and John talked about, the 10 Commandments do not actually begin with a rule, right? They begin with a rescue. Exodus 20 opens with God speaking these words, right? He says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Only after that, then God says, you shall have no other gods before me. And I think that order matters, right? God does not begin by saying, obey me, and then maybe I'll rescue you. he says, I have rescued you. I have brought you out. I have broken the power of Pharaoh. I have carried you through the sea. Now I've brought you to myself. Now let me show you how to be free, how free people live. Yep. Because that changes everything. The first commandment is often heard as this restriction, right? You're not allowed to have any other gods. I think, but Tim and John summarized the idea beautifully, right? This command portrays an exclusive devotion to God, not as something restrictive, but as something protective, right? It's anchored in God's rescue, his faithfulness to Israel. That's the example for us. I think so tonight, I want to ask some questions. What does it mean to have no other gods, right? Why does God begin here? And maybe how can this ancient command, how can this still speak to us today, right? Even in a world where most of us are not bowing down to statues of Baal and Asheroth or these gods of Egypt. Because maybe there's a deeper question that's not merely, do you believe in other gods? I think the deeper question is, really, where is your allegiance, right? What shapes your imagination? What do you fear losing? What do you serve without even realizing that you actually serve it? Because I think that is where the first commandment begins to move, right? From ancient stone tablets, it's drifting into the living room, the workspace, the bank account, the family system, the political imagination, the private habits of the heart, right? The private places, those quiet places where we make those decisions about who we really trust. So the first commandment is you shall have no other gods. But in Exodus 20, again, that statement doesn't stand alone, right? As Tim and John brought up, this is God's own self-identification, right? I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, who brought you out of the house of slavery, right? This is not a random intro. God names himself. God identifies himself, right? By relationship. And then God identifies himself in that relationship by action. So it's not just simply God sits on a shelf, right? This is Yod He Vav He. This is their God. This is our God. He is the one who brought them out of Egypt. He is the one who liberated them from slavery. He is the one who acted before they could act. Because Tim and John brought out that connection, right? Before Yahweh gives the 10 Commandments, he reminds Israel that he's the God who liberated them from slavery and is entering them into a covenant. Because I think that means the 10 Commandments are not these floating rules, right? They are not detached from a relationship. All of them are covenant words. They are the core of the covenant. All that follows reflects the lives of God's protected and freed people, right? They are given by the God who rescues. And I think that's important because many people, they still imagine God's commands as arbitrary tests. Somebody told them, almost like God is saying, right? Let's see if you can keep all of these. Let's see if you're good enough. Let's see if you deserve my love. Let's see if this will save you. But that's not how Exodus actually tells the story, right? God hears the cries of Israel. God remembers his covenant. He confronted Pharaoh. He sent Moses. He brought plagues to Egypt. He opened the sea. He fed them with manna. He gave them water in the wilderness. And then when we get to Sinai, God gives the covenant, including these 10 commandments, to his now freed people. Grace came before instruction. Rescue came before response. relationship came before obedience. So I think the first commandment's not the demand of some insecure deity trying to control people, no matter what you hear today. It's the voice of a rescuer that's saying, don't go back into slavery. Do not give your allegiance to the powers that destroyed you. Do not trust the gods of Egypt after I brought you out of Egypt. Do not let another Pharaoh sit on the throne of your heart. I think that is why this command is protective. It's not God taking freedom away. It's actually God guarding the freedom that he gave them. So maybe to understand the focus of the command, I think maybe we need to remember that ancient Israel, right, in their context, they lived in a world that was filled with gods. Context is important with this because the nations around them had gods of fertility, gods of war, gods of storms, gods of harvest, gods of the sea, gods of the underworld, right? Gods of empire, gods of family, gods of land, gods of power. In Egypt, Pharaoh himself was wrapped in these divine claims, and Egypt was not just a political system, right? It was a religious world. Its economy, its hierarchy, its temples, its labor system, its national identity, right? They're all tied to the gods. So when Yahweh brings Israel out of Egypt, he's not only rescuing them from hard labor, he's rescuing them from a total false worship system. Egypt had taught them what power looked like. Because with them, power looked like Pharaoh. Power looked like forced labor. Power looked like brick quotas. Power looked like empires, right? Power looked like fear. Power looked like the strong consuming the weak, right? But Yahweh reveals a different kind of power. He hears slaves. He acts for the oppressed. He defeats the gods of empire. He brings people through the water, feeds them in the wilderness. He descends to meet them on a mountain. And then, he says, you shall have no other gods before me. You now belong to a different story. You are no longer defined by Pharaoh's world. You are no longer to organize your life around the gods of production, fear, domination, scarcity. You're my people. The command is exclusive because the relationship is exclusive. Not because God's fragile, because love is covenantal, right? Marriage covenant does not say love your spouse, but also keep several backup relationships, just in case. The covenant says this relationship is a unique claim. In the same way Yahweh's relationship with Israel is not one loyalty amongst many, right? He's not asking to be added to the shelf. He's not saying, keep me as your favorite, right? Your favorite God. He's saying, no other gods, no rivals, no competitors, no divided allegiance, no going back to Egypt for your imagination. So I liked where Tim and John went with this. The phrase, it's often translated before me, right? It can carry a sense of before my face or in my presence. Yeah. This was King David's. This was his ultimate fear, right? This is hundreds of years on forward, but this is his biggest fear, that he would not be in God's face, that he would not be found before his face, that God would not see him. I think that's powerful because the command is not simply about public religious behavior. It's about living as freed people before the face of God. Israel cannot say, we worship Yahweh the tabernacle, but we have these other gods for the fields, family, the bank, the bedroom, the army, the future, right? God is not interested in being one compartment of life, right? He's not one department. He's not the religious. He's not the religious section of our otherwise self-directive lives, right? Our existence, right? He's the creator. He's the rescuer. He is the covenant God. So to live with no gods before him is to live an integrated life. It means that the God who rescued Israel is the God of worship, the God of family, work, justice, money, desire, sexuality, speech, rest, and neighbor love. I think this is where the first commandment begins to expose us, actually, because we may not keep literal idols in our homes. I think just we're very good at compartmentalizing God, right? We might say, you can have Sunday morning, Saturday for some of us, right? But not my anxiety. You can have my songs, but not my spending. You can have my prayers, but not my bitterness. You can have my beliefs, but not my politics. You can have my public self, but you cannot have my secret cravings. You can have my theology. You just can't have my trust. The first commandment says no. Not because God wants to crush us, but because divided worship divides the person. Jesus even said the same thing. When the heart has too many gods, the soul becomes fragmented. Because one part of us wants to trust God, but another part, it trusts money. The other part trusts control. The other part trusts approval, right? It trusts anger. It trusts pleasure. Trusts being right. Yeah? But eventually, we're pulled apart by the very thing we thought would rescue us. Okay, so maybe now we need to ask for us, what is a God, right? Because in the ancient world, a God was not merely an idea you believed in, right? God was a power that you trusted, right? The power you honored, power you feared, you served, you sacrificed to, something you depended on. I think that's why this command is not only about theology in that narrow sense. I think it's more about allegiance. Okay, so Tim and John brought up the point that the first commandment explores how a command about ultimate allegiance can keep us newly liberated Israel, that can help keep us and them free. Because I think the word allegiance is important. Because a God, whatever God, that's the one that receives your ultimate allegiance. God is whatever sits in place of that highest trust. I think a God is whatever you believe will give you life. Whatever you fear losing most, whatever tells you who you are, right? Without me, you're nothing. So then we ask, what do I obey when I'm afraid? What do I run to when I feel empty? How do I measure my worth? What do I believe I cannot live without? We ask those questions, and maybe that helps reveal some of our gods, right? God of money. Not money's a tool. Money can be a tool, right? But I'm talking about money as security, meaning money as identity. Money is the thing that whispers, if you have enough of me, you'll finally be safe. There's a God of approval, right? the need to be liked, the need to be praised, the fear of disappointing people, the exhaustion of managing everybody else's perceptions. Yeah? God of control. Because the belief that if I can manage every detail, prevent every problem, keep every person in line, I can finally rest. But control? Control might be one of the cruelest gods. It never gives rest. Truly, it only gives more anxiety. But that segues into the God of power. Yeah? Winning, dominating, being right, having the last word, staying above others. Yeah? I got a God of pleasure, not joy. Joy is a gift, but pleasure, that's an escape. Pleasure as anesthesia, right? Pleasure as a way to avoid grief, loneliness, avoid repentance, avoid responsibility. Yeah? Steal. For some, how about this? The God is family. I think it may sound strange because family is good. Yes. But even good things become destructive when they become ultimate things, right? A spouse cannot be God. Children cannot be God. Parents cannot be God. Ministry cannot be God. The church cannot be God. Even the Bible itself points beyond itself to God. Good things, I think they become idols when we ask them to give us what only God can give. With that thinking, then maybe that will provide some greater context for you of Jesus's words on family, right? Something to ponder amongst yourselves. So one of the greatest dangers of false gods is the way those false ones, they demand sacrifice, right? We owe it. So at first, those idols, I guess in a way, they promise life, but then eventually they take life, right? The God of money demands your peace, right? The God of approval, it demands your honesty. The God of control, that demands your relationships. The God of pleasure, that demands your integrity. The God of power demands your humility. The God of image, well, that demands your authenticity. The God of productivity, it demands your rest. The God of resentment, that demands your joy. So I think this is why the first commandment is protective. God's not saying, don't enjoy anything. He's saying, do not worship what will actually destroy you. I think that's a word we need. Because many of us are not tempted to abandon God openly, right? We don't do this openly. We are tempted to add other gods quietly, right? We don't renounce Yahweh. We don't renounce God. We just keep backup saviors, right? We say, I trust God, but I need everyone to approve me. I trust God, but I need to control what's going on. I trust God, but I also need enough money to guarantee I'll never be vulnerable, right? I trust God, but I also need this anger. I need this barrier to protect me. I trust God, but I also need distraction so I'll never have to sit in silence. So little by little, we create this crowded sanctuary. But the first commandment clears the room. No other gods. Not because God's trying to reduce life. Maybe it's because he's trying to restore what real life is. Let's go back to the opening verse. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So I believe this verse tells us how to hear every command that follows this. Pause. Ponder that. Think about that. This begins how you can move forward. It's the lens through which all the rest of what we read in the commandments will be seen. The commandments, they're not a ladder for slaves to climb into God's favor, right? These do not save us. They never have. They are a path of liberated people learning how to be free. So I think that means that the first commandment is not merely about avoiding false worship. It's actually about staying free. Imagine Israel standing at Sinai. They have physically left Egypt, right? But they still live with Egypt in their habits. Egypt may still live in their fears. Egypt may still live in their imagination. Egypt may still live in the way that they understand power. Egypt still lives in the way they respond to scarcity, right? We saw that in the wilderness. We have seen that struggle. When food is scarce, they want Egypt. When water was scarce, they accused Moses. When Moses is on the mountain too long, right? They made a golden calf. The body can leave slavery before the heart does. But the first commandment begins the work of freeing the heart. Because it says, I brought you out of Egypt. Now let me bring Egypt out of you. But I think that's a lifelong process. Because I think, as an example, I think we're going to reference those who passed before the children of Israel could actually enter the promised land, right? Examples. Many of us, we actually know what that feels like. Because you can be delivered from something and still think like you're trapped in it. You can be forgiven and still live like you're under shame. You can be loved and still live like you're an orphan, right? You can be provided for, you still feel ruled by scarcity. You can be called free, but you still end up obeying old masters. But the first commandment asks, who brought you out? Who holds your life? Who gets to define your freedom? Because the God who rescues, well, I think he gets to define the shape of a rescued life. He gets the right to define the shape of my life. Because later on in the Torah, Israel also received one of its central confessions, we call, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. That's in Deuteronomy 6, right? That's the Shema, right? The first commandment and the Shema, they're wedded. They belong together. No other gods means undivided love. It's not merely correct belief. It's not merely religious loyalty. It's love with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. So when Jesus is asked about the greatest commandment, he reaches for this very passage, right? He says the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. Eventually, we're going to get to the second greatest. We're going to get there eventually, I promise. We got a lot of commandments to go, but when we read no other gods, we should not only hear a prohibition, right? Because I think we should hear, at least in my upside down way of thinking, I do here, I think we should hear it as an invitation, right? An invitation to wholehearted love. I think God is saying, do not divide your heart among gods that can't love you back. Do not give your soul to powers that didn't create you. Do not give your strength to masters that are only consume you, right? Love me. Trust me. Walk with me. Let me be your God, right? I think that's deeply personal. And I know that's deeply relational. The first commandment is not simply a legal document, right? Truly, none of the commandments are they're not simply legal demands. They are all part of a relational call. It's about love ordered rightly, right? So as my dad continues to remind me, now, with all of that, rightly, he says, let's bring this into our own world, right? We've talked about rightly. So most of us are not tempted to worship the gods of Egypt by name, but we're surrounded by gods. We just have modern names, right? We have security, success, comfort, theology, celebrity, right? Consumption, self-expression, sex, power, youth, health, tribe, country, influence, certainty, reputation, right? So these things, they're not all evil in themselves, right? But they become gods when they receive that ultimate allegiance. Let's poke at a few, just for fun. Let's go somewhere. It's a God of success, right? Success says you are what you achieve. That sounds motivating, right, at first, right? It pushes us to work hard, right? To improve, to build, to produce. But when success becomes a god, that's when failure becomes unbearable, right? Rest now becomes guilt. People are now viewed as competitors. Work becomes identity. And then the soul becomes exhausted. And then the God of Israel says, you're not what you produce, you are mine. We have the God of comfort. Comfort says the highest good, right? That's just avoiding pain. So if comfort becomes God, then I think love might become impossible because love requires sacrifice, right? Parenting requires sacrifice. Marriage requires sacrifice. Friendship, healthy friendship requires sacrifice. Justice requires sacrifice. Discipleship requires sacrifice. So if comfort is God, then we're going to obey comfort even when God calls us to be courageous. God of control. That's easy. Control says you are safe only when you're in charge. Lots of movies say this. We've heard this line before. Control is an illusion, right? But we can steward. We can plan. We can prepare, right? But we cannot control life, right? We cannot control every outcome. We cannot control every person. Heck, we can't control tomorrow. But the God who brought Israel through the sea, right? He teaches his people to trust him in the wilderness one day at a time, right? Daily manna, daily bread, daily dependence. Something to think. God of outrage, right? This one in our time, this is powerful in our time, right? Because outrage says your anger proves you're righteous. We know sometimes anger is appropriate, that anger, the Bible itself has holy anger, very contextual, very specific. But outrage becomes a God when we feed on it. I think when it gives us identity, when it makes us feel superior, when we cannot imagine faithfulness without this contempt for something. The God of Israel is just, but he's equal balance of merciful. That's something to think about. Because if our God is outrage, we may win arguments or end up losing our souls or the souls of others along the way. Also today, the God of self. Yeah, this may be the most probably accepted God in modern culture. This is easy. The God of self says, your desires are ultimate, your truth is supreme, your identity is self-created, and no one can tell you who you are. But the biblical story? It says we're not self-made. It says we are created. We are actually addressed, right? We are called. We are rescued. We received life. But that doesn't diminish human dignity. I think it actually establishes our value does not come from self-invention. I think it comes from the Creator who made us in His image and the Redeemer who brings us out of bondage. I think one of the more important ideas of the Bible Project is what humans give their imagination, their desire, their allegiance to anything that's not the source of all reality, right? Because it's going to lead them down a path that dehumanizes us. It dehumanizes others. That's a profound word from them, right? All of us have heard this phrase before in church. We become what we worship. So if you worship power, well, we do become harsh. If we worship money, well, we become calculating. When we worship approval, well, at times we become false. If we worship pleasure, we become shallow. There is no love there. If we worship control, we just become anxious. Yeah. If we worship technology, we may start treating people like data. If we worship self, we lose the ability to love sacrificially. If we worship nation or tribe, we may begin to see outsiders as enemies instead of neighbors. I think the first commandment protects human dignity because only the true God can teach us to be truly human, right? In Genesis, humans are made in God's image. That means humans are designed, right, to reflect God's character into creation. But we have mirrors. I talk about grabbing them all the time and holding them, right? We have mirrors, but that shows us the image that others see, right? When humans worship created things, then that image, that's when we see it become distorted. It will always reflect something. That mirror will always show you something. It's just going to reflect the thing we serve. This is why worship is never private in its consequences, right? Think about this. What we worship shapes how we treat people. Because the God of Egypt built an economy on slave labor. Yeah, the God of Israel, he heard the cries of slaves. That's a difference that matters. False gods use people. True gods, the true God, rescues people. False gods demand the weak be sacrificed for the strong. The true God commands the strong to protect the weak. False gods, well, they create pharaohs. But the true God created a covenant people called to justice, mercy, worship, rest, and neighbor love. The first commandment is not just about religious purity, right? It's about becoming the kind of people who can live rightly with God and with others. Let me toss this out. I believe the first commandment also sets the foundation for the rest of the commandments. Because if Yahweh alone is God, then idols cannot define worship, right? If Yahweh alone is God, then his name cannot be carried falsely, right? Or used falsely. If Yahweh alone is God, then Sabbath rest, well, that becomes an act of trust. If Yahweh alone is God, then parents and the generations, they matter. If Yahweh alone is God, then human life is sacred. If Yahweh alone is God, then marriage, covenants, they matter. If Yahweh alone is God, then theft becomes a violation of neighbor love. Yeah? If Yahweh alone is God, then truth matters. If Yahweh alone is God, then coveting reveals a heart trained by scarcity instead of gratitude. Everything flows from the allegiance to God. A skewed worship leads to a disordered life, right? An aligned worship leads to wisdom. We're actually talking about that in our Outside the Class series regarding Solomon. Yeah? The wisest man. We'll talk about his life later. But that is why the first commandment why it comes first. Because God is not merely giving Israel and us, he's not giving us just this moral checklist. He is actually reordering our loves. He's teaching us how to live as free people under the rule of the true king. Yeah? The commandments, they're not just about behavior. They're about formation, right? They form a people who look very different from Egypt. A people who do not enslave, a people who rest, a people who honor life, a people who practice truth, a people who resist coveting, a people who worship the God who rescued them. And then when we come to the New Testament, the first commandment then does not disappear, right? Yeshua, Jesus deepens it. When Jesus is tempted in the wilderness, the tempter, he offers him the kingdoms of the world, power without service, rule without suffering, glory without obedience. Jesus, he responds with scripture. Worship the Lord your God, serve him only. That's the first commandment in action. No other gods. Not even the God of power. Even power used for seemingly good ends, right? Jesus refuses to gain the world by bowing to a false master, right? That matters to us. Because temptation often comes not from an obvious evil. This was a shortcut. A way to get security without trust. A way to get influence without humility, right? A way to get pleasure without covenant. It's a way to get justice without love, a way to get glory without surrender. Jesus shows us what undivided allegiance looks like. The tempter tried to rattle the foundation. If I rattle the foundation, I can start to crumble everything down past it. He can't do that. The Messiah lives before the face of the Father. So, he doesn't serve money. He doesn't serve public approval, right? He doesn't serve political expectations, right? He doesn't serve fear. He doesn't serve self-preservation. He serves the Father. So for followers of Yeshua, right, for followers of Jesus, the first commandment becomes even more personal. Because I think the God who says, I brought you out of Egypt, I think he's also the God who, sending the Messiah, brings all of us in history out of that bondage, out of sin, out of shame, out of ultimate death, out of the dominion of false masters. With that in context, then he says, now live free. So I want to ask you a few questions. I do. I think these are important. If God is both the one who made Israel and the one who rescued them, so what does it say about why he gives them these commandments? The whys, right? Because I think in our resistance, we're not aware. We need to think of that. I think that's a central question. Because he gives those commands as creator and redeemer. He pulled them out, right? Because God knows what humans are made for. He knows what slavery does to the human heart. So what if God's commands are not barriers to joy, like we tend to look at them, but what if they were viewed as pathways to life? What if no other gods is not God narrowing your world, but what if it's God protecting you from powers that would consume you, right? Because what if the thing you're fearing is the same thing that's been enslaving you? What if freedom is not the ability to serve any desire, to have my own choices? That's what free means. But it's really the grace of belonging wholly to the God who actually gives life. What if the first commandment is not just do not worship other gods, but also do not forget who rescued you? So I think those are questions worth sitting around with folks, discussing. Coffee and donuts at the ready. I think we already need refills. The first commandment. It's not an isolated religious rule. It's the beginning of a liberated life. It sets the tone. It sets the attitude for all that is to follow. The instructions of what God has and what his liberated people, what they'll look like. I'm the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That's the foundation. You'll have no other gods before me. That's the response. The command, it begins with rescue. That's where it calls for allegiance. It protects freedom. It exposes idols. It reorders love. And it invites us into an undivided devotion, right, to the God who created us, who hears us, who rescues us, and who teaches us how to live. Yeah? This has been fun. This has been, for me, an eye-opening Dusty Feet path journey. Yeah, for sure, right? In really digging into this. So as we continue through the 10 Commandments, let's remember that they're not merely ancient rules carved into stone. They are covenant words from the God who rescues. And remember, the first word is not obey. First word, I brought you out. Because he brought us out. And now we're invited to be free. So until next time, keep walking the dusty path. Open eyes, humble hearts, feet ready to follow. Shalom, shalom.